Good evening, and welcome to the League of Women Voters General Meeting on Economic Development and Portland Development Commission. Our Action Committee has had a long history of monitoring and advocating on issues pertaining to urban renewal and economic development. Our League's action is taken based on membership education and consensus that results in a position statement. We recognize that not every League member has a full understanding of the urban renewal mechanisms and that much has changed in the 30 years that the League has last studied these issues. In our study, we tried to explain the changes that have occurred, where we are today, and what we see as the issues coming in the future. In May of 2012, the general membership approved this study and the potential of combining the goals, two position statements we had, into one. In the past 2.5 years, our committee has met with more than 24 experts from private industry and public entities. We toured industrial sites wearing hard hats. We spent many hours discussing these complex and tangled issues in order to bring this update to our membership. I would like to thank the study committee. Every member made a strong contribution to this effort, and it was a privilege working with you. Barbara Dudley, Barbara Stallions, Carol Wilson, where's Carol? Carol Wilson, Debbie Iona, and Peggy Bengry. Thank you so much. I'd also like to thank our League reviewers and editors, Carol Cushman, Debbie Kay, Margaret Knoll, and Pat Osborne. Thank you so much for your help. And many thanks to our members assisting tonight's meeting, with Norman Terrell with our technical assistance, and Julie Chapman is our timer. Thank you. At the end of the panel presentation, we'll have time to take questions from the audience. If you have questions, please write them down on the index cards. We have Barbara Stallions and Peggy Bengry will be handing out index cards. Write your questions down, and we will bring them up for the Q&A part at the end of the meeting. We are grateful to the Portland Development Commission for the help with our study. We started the exploration of interviews at PDC by meeting with Keith Witowski, Morgan Masterman, and Kimberly Schneider-Branham. And towards the end of our study, we then had the privilege to meet with Executive Director Patrick Quinton and discuss the issues and what we had learned. Both Justin Douglas and Morgan Masterman agreed to be our technical reviewers, which is an important part of the League process, where we ask experts to review our study and right before we go to print to make sure that everything is accurate for you. In addition, we have two speakers on tonight's panel, Chris Harder and Lisa Abuaf, to represent PDC. And tonight we also have Tom Kelly, the Portland Development Commission's current chair. Thank you for coming. Tonight we have a panel of speakers that represent a broad range of both public and private experience in developing our Portland's economy. Chris Harder is the Economic Development Director for the Portland Development Commission. He leads the city business development efforts as well as strategies to support entrepreneurship, innovation, and international trade. Lisa Abuaf is the Central City Manager for Portland Development Commission. She is responsible for the city business development for implementing the Portland's comprehensive and central city plans within specific neighborhoods. John Russell is the founder of the Russell Development Company. He has a long history of citizen involvement, including chairing the Portland Development Commission, the Mayor's Business Roundtable, and the Mayor's Blue Ribbon Committee for Economic Development. Ray Espana is the Deputy Director of the Native American Youth and Family Center, which provides a broad range of culturally specific services to urban Native community. He is a member of the Portland Housing Advisory Commission and the PDC Neighborhood Economic Development Leadership Group. I would now like to introduce Barbara Dudley, our moderator. She is a senior fellow at the Center for Public Service at Portland State University's Hatfield School of Government, and she will now be leading our presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Beth. The format for tonight, we're going to jump right into presentations by our four speakers, and the format is that each speaker will have 12 minutes, and we have a timer here, so just green cards, keep your eyes open. And then at the end of the 4 presentations, we will have time for questions from the audience. Don't forget to hold up your hand if you have a question, and one of our 2 team members back there will bring you an index card. So that's how we're going to proceed. We asked each of our speakers certain questions in terms of preparing for tonight. So we're going to start with Chris, and the general question that we wanted him to address was basically that how he would describe the city's mandate for economic development and what the role of the PDC has been and how it's changed over the past 30 years. So with that, I'll let Chris begin.
Sure, thank you. And thank you for inviting us here tonight. Both Lisa and Abuaf are honored to present, as well as be up front with John and Ray as well. So we're going to go through a presentation to hopefully answer that question and a couple others that you posed to us, and I'm going to try and do it within 12 minutes. So I got a lot of content to cover. So the first, I want to jump right in, and not going to read it word for word, but this is the Portland Development Commission's mission statement as well as vision statement. And the purpose for that is just to reinforce that since 1958, we've obviously been the city's redevelopment agency, and since 1980, we've assumed another role around economic development, and that role has expanded. Over the last 5 to 10 years. I think it's important to highlight this dual role. I'll present on the economic development side, and Lisa will present on the redevelopment side. So before I answer the question, I also want to make one other caveat. There's a lot of work within PDC. My presentation is going to focus on our traded sector work. You guys referenced that in your study. We have folks who work in our neighborhoods in community development that also do economic development, but Ray is one of our key partners in that effort, so I think he will represent kind of that ecosystem very well. So first off, to talk about kind of what is economic development and how has it progressed and what's PDC's role been, it's worthwhile to talk about kind of the waves over the last 50 to 60 years. We've definitely transitioned from both in Portland and I would say nationally, around strategies and efforts around industrial recruitment and large incentives, to later stages of economic development that really focused on cost and efficiency, and that could be at the civic level around taxes, or that could be within businesses as well. And we've been operating under what we kind of refer to as a third wave industry competitiveness for the last 15 to 20 years. And I would argue, because we are going through a strategic planning process, although I'm not an economic development theorist, that we're probably starting to enter a fourth phase, and I'll get into that during my presentation. So to begin, I just want to emphasize when you talk traded sector economic development, first off, traded sector, these are industries and businesses that produce products and services that can be sold outside your region, around the world. And the idea is that revenue and income comes back into your community. It supports what we would refer to as local economic or businesses, retail, restaurants, those types of jobs. But when we think of traded sector economy, it's many things. So it's not one action, and it's certainly not one organization. So PDC is blessed to have many great partners. When we think about economic development, we have organizations such as Business Oregon and Greater Portland, Inc. that do economic development at the state and regional level. We have workforce development organizations such as Work Systems Inc. and our community colleges. Certainly we have our academic and institutions such as PSU and OHSU, chambers of commerce such as Portland Business Alliance, neighborhood-focused entities such as Venture Portland, the Port of Portland itself. So there's many organizations that work in the field of economic development and have different focus areas. Wanted to kind of walk through three just the state, region, and local level, and emphasize that I think the important thing I want to get across on this slide is that there's strong collaboration between these three entities. Our focuses differ in terms of geography, and certainly in terms of how we, on different topics, which organizations take a convener role and which take an implementation role. There are some differences there. I actually have several examples, so if perhaps at the end I can walk through, whether it's a recruitment or one of our entrepreneurship programs or international trade programs, how these organizations and others work together. We leverage our resources together, in many cases, to tackle what are some very complex problems and issues. So to talk about kind of where we are going forward and how we view economic development from the PDC perspective, I'm going to highlight 4 areas that really define our work now and certainly will define our work over the next several years. And the first is around business development and target industries. This is really an area that allows us to partner with businesses one-on-one. So staff on our at PDC meet with businesses, large and small, and work through issues, typically expansion or growth issues in a good economy, and in a not so good economy, it could be market access or supply chain opportunities. We do about 350 business visits a year with traded sector firms across industry, and we focus those efforts around direct and referral assistance. So we may assist a company in-house, but we may refer to a partner if there's a workforce issue. That's an obvious case where we pull in our partner in Work Systems Inc. We have 4 industries where we target this, and that's for a couple of reasons. One, we have industries in our economy that are our competitive advantage. It's what drives our growth as a region. Targeting on 4 also allows us to prioritize limited public resources. So it allows us to develop those deeper relationships with the industries and firms. Just a couple of facts about that work. Related to our financial programs, which are at times a key piece of this. Those have led to over 4,000 new jobs and retained around 1,700 in the last 5 years. And you can see our leverage numbers up on the screen in terms of what we invest in a company and then what the leverage is from the private side. Entrepreneurship or growing your own is a core value. We tend not to be have a big focus on recruitment. We believe that if you invest in the companies that are here, that's going to lead to your longer term economic success and outcomes. And the fact is, PDC relies on small business success, or I'm sorry, Portland relies on small business success. 80% of businesses are less than 20 employees in the city. And from a return on investment perspective, we feel that supporting these higher growth traded sector firms at their earliest stages will give us the best return in the long run. I don't think there's many, I can't think of an example where a Fortune 500 company has been recruited to a region. Typically those are homegrown, and we can look up north to our neighbor in Seattle and see the multiple that they have up there. The city has decided, and through PDC, that in order for us to support entrepreneurs, we had to be entrepreneurial ourselves. So we have a couple successful programs that we like to talk about. One is the Portland Seed Fund. So we used city general fund dollars to help create the Portland Seed Fund, invested in it. We have fund managers that take that money and have raised private money along with it and then invest in local startups in our community. To date, the 46 companies that have been served through that program have created close to 400 new jobs, and this is only in, we're in year 3, so really a 2-year figure, and attracted more than $40 million in outside investment. So $750 of city money attracting $40 million in outside investment. So for us, that's a really good return on investment. The two companies you see up on the screen represent an area that we think is a growth area for us in terms of supporting entrepreneurs. I won't go into too much detail, but Globe Sherpa, if you ride the bus, it's a local company that developed an app on your phone to purchase tickets, so you no longer have to do it at the counters on the street or in other forums. They developed their product and company by partnering with TriMet. So it's a great example of the public sector serving as an incubator for a local startup. Lucid Energy has an in-pipe water turbine that's currently testing right now with our Water Bureau. We have a program right now in place to match local startups with city, giving access to new technologies to our bureaus, but also supporting entrepreneurs in our city. Just two examples of how we support entrepreneurship. Probably the largest issue facing our economy now is what I would refer to as two economies. We have a very high growth economy, one that's doing very well, and we have many in our community who aren't sharing in the benefits of our growth currently. So a key focus of the Portland Development Commission, and we just sent out earlier this week a draft strategic plan. You'll notice its emphasis in that is around inclusion and shared prosperity. So on the traded sector side, for us, you can see some of the numbers. Only 1% of companies that seek investment are founded by Black and Latino founders. That is extremely small. Most are white and male. So we have efforts through the PDC to broaden our startup activity and entrepreneurship activity and be more inclusive to women and communities of color.
Chris, I'm not sure the slide changed.
Oh, did I not? I'm sorry. There you go. Sorry. That should make more sense. Couple initiatives. I3PDX, Include, Innovate, Invest Portland, is a discussion series and a series of meetups to work with communities of color and women around pursuing entrepreneurship activities. We've launched the Startup PDX Challenge, which is a national competition where we provide free rent for a year, working capital grants, a whole host of in-kind services to founders of color and women, and we have had great success this year with that program. I would say a focus of us going forward, particularly as if you have a chance to read our new draft strategic plan, is really focusing on access to quality, what we would term middle wage jobs that pay above $42,000, but require less than a bachelor's degree. We also have efforts around increasing our community benefits. So equity, inclusion, a core priority for us. And then finally, I won't go, I'm getting the sign up there. As much as we need to refocus internally and create prosperity within our city, we still are a global city. And so we have many efforts right now focused on how we position our businesses and industries to think external and to seek markets outside of the US. We have a pilot program. We're one of 4 cities in the country developing a metro and city-led export strategy and foreign direct investment strategy. We've had some very early success through programs around what we call We Build Green Cities, taking our green building firms, architecture and engineering firms to Japan, Colombia, and China. So it's definitely an area of growth for us, and we'd be more than willing to answer questions should they come up. One last slide, 15 seconds. Where are we going, and what's the path forward, and what are some of our challenges? We've been recognized on the economic development front for having some best practice work, although I think we still operate with some fairly limited funding, in particularly general fund. Everything I've talked about, doesn't access our urban renewal resources. It relies on the city's general fund, and so that can be a barrier for growing that. And then I think where we're going was really those last two slides: global engagement and how we position our businesses and industries globally, and then tackling the concept or the challenge of widely shared prosperity.
Thank you, Chris. And we're going to go on now with Lisa, and I think she will help us understand. Our report looked at both economic development generally and urban renewal specifically, and Lisa's going to focus a bit more on urban renewal and what has happened with it over the last 30 years as an economic development tool.
I hate to take you back in time, but here I think I'll turn to John and John can feel free to jump in.
Lisa, you're not old enough.
I know, you'd be surprised. So one of the questions that was asked is kind of just give us a snapshot in time of how PDC has changed over the past 30 years. And to situate you or to kind of benchmark you, 30 years ago, PDC was involved with opening and launching Pioneer Courthouse Square.
There we go. So 30 years ago, 1984, is when Pioneer Courthouse Square opened. So you can imagine how different of a place Portland is today from the day that Pioneer Square opened. At the same time, nearby, PDC had the South Park Blocks urban renewal area, and a significant amount of the investment, if you look at that urban renewal area, was in downtown housing. It was not the Portland you see today where you had kind of a significant amount of demand in the market for downtown housing. And so a lot of the original housing that was placed in downtown, both market rate and affordable, was actually done through the South Park Blocks urban renewal area. Fast forwarding 10 years, and I would say urban renewal continued to be, and kind of PDC's activities around redevelopment continued to be predominantly central city focused. So we did a lot of work around Pioneer Place. Urban renewal was used as a tool in terms of attracting a mall that would allow downtown to continue to be competitive with kind of the regional malls that were in the uptick at that time. East Bank Esplanade was built. We did a lot of investment in also job growth and the commercial development of downtown, and this is something that kind of, as Chris talks with businesses, has been really important to Portland's competitiveness. The fact that we have a vibrant downtown, it's a place that talent and firms want to be and want to locate, has made us able to continue to compete with Cruiseway and other areas, kind of other suburban office areas. And at the same time, plans were set, and this was mostly done coming off of the Central Portland plan. Plans were set for increasing density in the downtown core. So that's where you see the plans set for the Pearl District and South Waterfront that were then implemented through urban renewal as a tool to accomplish the redevelopment goals, the longer-term redevelopment goals of the city. And then at the turn of the century, so we're getting kind of closer to the 2000s, it's when you see urban renewal shift and we started to have more of a neighborhood focus. So it's when the Lentz urban renewal area, the Gateway urban renewal area, and the Interstate urban renewal area were created. And I would say a lot of our early investments were done via infrastructure. So a lot of investments were done into light rail and streetscapes. And I'll walk you through a little bit of how PDC's approach in terms of infrastructure investment has shifted, especially in the neighborhoods. So what have we learned, or what's changed? I think one of the questions was what's changed over the past 30 years? One is, as Chris indicated, PDC really adjusts to market cycles. Most of the work that we do is in partnership with the private sector, and more so than other bureaus, we tend to adjust to the private sector's needs and or where there are gaps in the public accomplishing the goals that are set out in our longer range plans. Second, Portland's changed. I think Portland is a different place today. It has different demographics. It has different needs than it did 30 years ago, and you'll see PDC shift over time to address those public needs. Third, we have different regulatory legislation. So clearly there's different property tax legislation and different urban renewal legislation in Oregon and in Portland, including revenue sharing. And so kind of good examples of where you see PDC revenue sharing in close partnership with the county is in the Pearl District or the River District urban renewal area, where revenue sharing has already been triggered. And then also we'll talk a little bit about neighborhood prosperity areas, where that's also kind of a case study of revenue sharing in terms of accomplishing shared goals. And then last is, I would say, urban challenges have only gotten more complex over the past 30 years. And so it's similar to what Chris kind of referenced. Everything we do touches partners and requires partners. So from the Neighborhood Prosperity Initiative to working really closely with our partner bureaus to Greater Portland, Inc., everything PDC does, we do very much in partnership with other bureaus, with other organizations, with other communities, with business organizations, et cetera. So that kind of sets the stage for more of where we are today. Oh, it didn't go. Sure. So in terms of, I can't move it.
No, you can just aim it, though. There you go.
I usually talk loudly. So in terms of where we are today, I would say PDC, as we undertake redevelopment activities, because I would really say urban renewal is a tool to accomplish the redevelopment goals of the city, whether they're infrastructure, vertical development, placemaking goals of the city. Urban renewal is a financing tool and a mechanism to accomplish those goals, is we've taken a much more integrated approach. And two good recent examples of that are the Old Town Chinatown Action Plan and the Lentz Action Plan. And one of the questions is, how do we do outreach? These action plans were literally put in place with the community. So there were extensive workshops with the Old Town Chinatown Community Association where we gathered their input. They gave edits to the action plan. This was really their plan. It's a plan that commits. So both plans actually look at an integrated approach where we don't just look at properties and redevelopment loans or grants to work with private property owners, or where we buy property and put it out for redevelopment, but we did it very intentionally where we thought about real estate or redevelopment-based activities. We worked really closely with Chris's team about business development activities. So what kind of businesses are attracted to that area? How do we make sure that they're locating in the buildings? How do we make sure that we're building buildings that will attract jobs, both to our neighborhoods and to our downtown? And then we've done a lot of work around district livability, and you'll see this particularly in Old Town Chinatown and our neighborhoods, which is we administer both through things like our community livability grants, which are being used for historic preservation, the cultural functions within Old Town Chinatown, as well as with a function called district managers that we have both in our neighborhood prosperity initiatives as well as Old Town Chinatown, which is really the idea of in certain communities where kind of nonprofit capacity may be lacking around business development, we help and provide technical assistance in that role as well. So I would say kind of one of the major shifts that's happened is really thinking in a more integrated way between who's in the communities, the capacity of those communities, the businesses that are in those communities, and business development, so that we make sure that there are jobs on the ground, as well as the place-based activities, the parks, the infrastructure, the vertical development. You'll see we've taken a very similar approach in the neighborhood. So I would say going back to the 2000s, as we think about how did we do light rail, how did we do some of the early streetscapes, in particular in Kenton or other interstate areas, is today when we go out and do infrastructure improvements with our partner bureaus, we actually literally do it in conjunction with what Chris referenced, which is we have a community economic development team. So they go up and down each street, they meet with every business, they provide technical assistance to those businesses, we provide storefront grants to those businesses in terms of facade improvements. We've done a lot of work, and you'll see this also similarly as we think about shared prosperity and thinking about who owns properties in those communities that we're going into and investing. We have a long-time property owner project that we've been undertaking for about 2 years now, where we work with longtime property owners so that they're able to leverage the investments and the wealth potential that's created by urban renewal resources being invested in their community. As a result of that, we've helped kind of along our corridors, we've helped about 200 businesses with storefronts. So again, in conjunction on corridors like Halsey-Weidler, like corridors like Lombard. And then we've also worked with about 15 longtime property owners. And it's been a really, I would say, challenging and interesting opportunity in terms of working with longtime property owners, of being intentional about thinking about how we create shared wealth out in communities, but also making sure that we're not getting property owners kind of into something that they don't necessarily, they can't necessarily succeed at. And then the last example that I'll just go through in terms of kind of touching on more, how does PDC do its work today, is the Neighborhood Prosperities Initiative. And this is where I'll ask Ray to kind of jump in, because I'm sure this is something he has a lot more depth than me, because this is actually Kate's team works quite a bit in these areas. But the Neighborhood Prosperity Initiative was really intentional about thinking about where urban renewal as a tool could be used in an innovative way. So these are smaller urban renewal areas. They're out in the communities. Again, if you think about urban renewal more of as a financing mechanism than an ends unto itself, it was thinking intentionally about community-driven goals and outcomes. It was thinking differently about how we debt in terms of our urban renewal, and it was thinking differently about how we partner with the county. The areas were actually selected in partnership with folks like the communities of color and others within the community. So we were pretty intentional about looking at areas where you had a high population of communities of color, so that the benefits could really kind of go back into the community. And you had real challenges around poverty, in particular in the Outer East Side. We do have, one of the questions was also kind of thinking differently about outreach and how we do outreach today. There's a neighborhood leadership group that does convene and tracks and monitors our neighborhood economic development strategy, and I hope that Ray will speak further about it. It's similar, again, if you go back to the Old Town Chinatown action plan, it's about putting the plans in place with the community so that they really are bought in, and it's really theirs to shepherd forward over the long run. So a little bit about looking forward and thinking differently about urban renewal. I think many of you are familiar with this, or I know Debbie at the very least is our specialist in this. But we were charged about a year ago by the mayor's office. He requested that PDC take a strategic look at urban renewal and really assess where it could be best used as a tool. And as a result of that, there's a proposed package that has gone before our board and is planned to go before council. And the charge when he asked us to look at the amendment package was threefold. One was to mitigate the impact of urban renewal on taxing jurisdictions. The second was to strategically align where urban renewal as a tool was available to the city's economic development, redevelopment, and housing goals, and in particular following on the heels of planning's long-range planning work around the Portland Plan and the Central Portland Plan. And third, because kind of the education urban renewal area was always on the table, I would say, making sure that the city kind of maintained its support and partnership with Portland State University, given its regional importance and its importance as an access education provider for our city. So as a result, there is a package that's on the table. It makes changes to 6 urban renewal areas. The 4 that you see here are actually proposed for either closure or contracting. So things like the River District, we would actually contract it because there's excess value that was generated from the new development that's occurred, and so that would return even more resources back to all of the taxing jurisdictions. Things like Airport Way have actually concluded as an urban renewal area, and so there are excess resources as well. Overall, the impacts to taxing jurisdictions would be about $350 million over 30 years, or $135 million or so net present value over the 30 years that would go back to the taxing jurisdictions as a result of this overall package. There are also 2 urban renewal areas that are proposed for expansion or extension. And really the important factor here as we talk about Central East Side and North Mac is really thinking about what opportunities are outstanding, especially as we look at the Central Portland Plan and kind of the next 30 years of growth that are anticipated for the Central City. And in particular, there's kind of interest around affordable housing. And we can talk further around kind of how urban renewal is really kind of the major funding source for the city in terms of affordable housing. And so we'll put incremental resources on the table for that. I'll jump through these slides. This is a particularly important slide, and you'll see it. I'm going to kind of jump to the last slide as we think about our next 5 years. So as we think about our next 5 years, they're really the closeout of most of our existing urban renewal areas. And so our board chair, as well as our board, has tasked us with thinking about what are the other resources, similar to what PDC has done in the past with new market tax credits, that could come in and accomplish the city's ongoing redevelopment goals in lieu of urban renewal. And so we're looking at things like property assessed clean energy and other tax credit mechanisms. And then last but not least, as Chris referenced, we are undertaking an updated strategic planning effort. What you see here is kind of hot off the presses. It's our 50% draft. We're undertaking outreach to the public. So you'll see there's 2 open houses down there that you guys are welcome to join or to go online. The last is a link where you're welcome to go online. And the overarching goal of this strategic plan is about shared prosperity. So it's thinking about, again, how does an integrated ecosystem of place, businesses, individuals, capacity building really contribute to accomplishing shared prosperity across Portland.
Thank you. Thanks, Lisa. I know 12 minutes is inadequate for what we're trying to do here for all of you, but we're going to keep going. John Russell has several different perspectives he brings to the table, both as a civic leader in planning and also as a private sector developer. So we're looking to him to give us some judgment about how he thinks the city is functioning in economic development, what works, what doesn't, et cetera.
Well, thank you, Barbara. First of all, I'm flattered to be invited with this august group. And I would like to say that the report was stunning to me. I read it all through. I learned some things in the process, and I will admit there are some things that I don't understand. But it's a very impressive document. As Barbara said, my perspective comes from being involved in planning in a variety of different ways and in developing properties. I served on the Landmark Commission for 8 years, the Planning Commission for 4 years, the Development Commission for 3, the last is chair, State Transportation for 8 years, Mayor's Business Roundtable for 10 years. So I've seen a lot. And I think it's worth elaborating. I'm much older than Lisa. I can talk about things, go further back. But I think it's important to see the changes that have occurred. And let me just list the major ones that I've seen. First of all, gentrification used to be, well, it's now a pejorative term. It didn't used to be. I mean, in the 60s, we completely obliterated all the property between 4th and Front and Market and the then new I-405. And people, I mean, there was popular acclaim for that enormous amount of gentrification. And I think, well, what I hope is true is that people have decided, well, it's gone from a pejorative term. I think there's a greater understanding of the difference between gentrification and displacement. Mary and I went to the premiere of a movie that local people had done trying to prove the evils of gentrification, and what they discovered is that that really wasn't the issue. One of the case studies they had was an African-American single mother who owned her own home, and that's the key thing, living next to a meth house. She wanted gentrification, but people in that neighborhood who were renters didn't. So when I was chair of PDC, we worked very hard to try to convert renters to owners, and so to prevent displacement, that's the real problem. Secondly, condemnation used to be just the way things were done, and the pendulum, I'm sure, swung way too far in that direction. In my view, it swung way too far in the other direction. It's basically off the table now. You don't even see the county looking at condemning the remainder of the block on their first choice site for the new county courthouse, as an example. Thirdly, affordable housing, which didn't used to be a big factor, has now become it's a big business. It's a big, I mean, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars being spent on it. And I have some, later on I'll talk about what I think can be added to that. Fourthly, and this I think is really important to me, and it's a change that's happened so slowly, it's a little bit like the frog in the water, hot water thing. The Planning Bureau, when I served on the Planning Commission, was a bold body. We didn't look over our shoulder to see what the council wanted us to rule, and we didn't shirk from fights. And I think over the course of the last 20 years, planning has become much less bold, and I call it the kumbaya planning. We're all in this together, there's no real issues that divide us when there really are issues. And the role used to be very distinct between planning and PDC. And I think that distinction's been lost at enormous expense. Lentz, for example, was declared, the city council just declared that an urban renewal area out of a conviction that it was blighted. What it should have done is it should have instructed the Planning Bureau to identify the changes in the neighborhood that the neighborhood wanted. There should have been a list of things that were vetted, and only then should PDC have been brought in like a SWAT team to get those things done. I think the report says that $96 million has been spent in Lentz with nothing happening. And that's just staff time of planning and PDC. PDC in the placemaking area, as I say, should be a SWAT team. And fifth, industrial land held in private hands is an illusion. You need patient public hands to hold industrial lands. And there was a time when there was vacant land in Swan Island. The Port of Portland had that. It's a public entity. There was a time when there's vacant land in Rivergate, and we're running out not just of industrial land, but industrial land held in the right hands, namely the public. In terms of economic development, Vera Katz asked me to chair what Barbara referred to as the Blue Ribbon Committee on Economic Development, and it was a massive effort. We had people from Hillsborough, we had people from Gresham, 50-odd people. The report was this thick, and I think we failed in one respect to what Vera pleaded with me. She said, "Tell me 8 things I can do." Well, we didn't. We gave her an inch-thick report. So here are my own conclusions. First of all, in terms of what the public sector can do for economic development, I think it's easy to overstate what the public sector can do to promote economic development. And I don't diminish anything that Chris and Lisa are doing, and it needs to be done, but it's not the panacea. You can't, companies don't relocate here unless, if companies who have employees don't relocate here because they've got tax incentives, their employees will dictate where they go. In a sense, you can't really buy with tax incentives employment. You can buy investment. You can cause an industrial site, a warehouse to be built with incentives, but not an employer. So here are my prescriptions about what should happen in the future. First of all, we need to focus on public sector capital. It's very scarce. It's scarce in our family. It's scarce in your family. Every nonprofit, profit entity the capital is scarce. We all know that the gas tax is disappearing at a quick rate. TriMet is always, it is funded with a payroll tax, but that's how it generates capital. But actually, it doesn't. I'm sorry, it doesn't generate capital. It generates operating expenses. And the council have been wrestling with street fee alternatives, but those mechanisms for generating capital are critical. Obviously, the tax increment financing, which is disappearing with Lisa's slide, is the way that the city has generated investment capital. Secondly, I would hope that this legislature will eliminate the ban on inclusionary zoning. Thank you. Yeah, it was really bad public policy. The governor claims he doesn't remember not vetoing it, but he's still apologetic. And it's not the panacea, but affordable housing done with urban renewal money has the unintended consequence of concentrating poverty. So you take a blighted area and you invest in affordable housing in that area, and it's just not the way to treat people of that income level in the best. I mean, they should be spread out. Lake Oswego should have affordable housing. And inclusionary zoning does that. Third, and this may be the most important thing, we've got to change the culture of the Planning Bureau. And I've alluded to that before, but if you think about it, Mayor Potter, Mayor Adams, and Mayor Hales have all had comprehensive plans, and particularly the one that was done under Potter was just pure pablum. And again, I'm probably showing my age. People don't know what pablum is, but I mean, it was just platitudes, and it wasn't terribly helpful in terms of identifying very specific issues. The thing that really gripes me currently is that the Southeast Quadrant, for example, which is undergoing a comprehensive plan, isn't dealing with the fact that I-5 is on the surface. It's not dealing with the fact that the railroad is on the surface, because those issues are too hard, but that's ridiculous. A comprehensive plan looking ahead 30 years needs to address those kinds of things. Fourthly, I think West Hayden Island needs to be dealt with, and the railroad bridge that continues across Hayden Island needs to have its channel changed more toward the center of the river so that the highway bridge upstream can be done correctly. Fifth, and this may seem, I'm not sure in whose purview it is, high school curriculums, I think, need to be broadened. I mean, that's a very important economic development tool. I think we all know that. And sixth, ideally, and Chris alluded to this a bit, the Silicon Valley is the success that it is because it's the center of venture capital. And ideally, the seed fund that you talked about, Chris, I think is critical. I'm a nominee for the state, to be on the state's, the Oregon Investment Council, which invests the $70 billion in pension funds, and perhaps we can be a source of venture capital for this city and for this state. So thank you.
Thank you. That's a lot to go with here. So now we will conclude the formal presentations with Ray, and a lot has already been handed to you by our other speakers. So, but the task that we set forward for you is to speak to how government funding for economic development can benefit the entire city, all communities. That may be too much to ask of somebody to answer, but
should we just start there? Just start there.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. It's a blessing to be with you tonight and be a part of this panel, and much respect to the presenters, Mr. Russell. And I'm going to offer just a perspective from a community person who works at an urban Indian center here called NEA Family Center. My background in community economic development is I kind of learned the ropes, so to speak, with a tour of duty, kind of working with a venture capitalist and looking at how you do deals. And I spent some time learning the art of the deal. And so I learned that what it takes, and I felt that was not for me, but I went to school there. And it's very simply, as Mr. Russell said, to get an investor here, it's not about all the incentive, it's whether it makes the business case for you, depending on where you want to be. So I'm going to try to wrap up or address a number of things you've heard tonight. I'm more closely involved with the PDCs, or the city's neighborhood economic development strategy, and I'm directly involved with the Neighborhood Prosperity Initiative, and we're one of the 6 NPI areas. I represent the Cully Boulevard Alliance. That's kind of the area that I work with. One of the questions that may have been asked of the group to address, and that is, what is economic development? And I learned economic development as simply being job creation. There's a lot of other things that happens, but it's the creation of a job. It's a permanent job. And that's my definition for economic development. So if it does not serve that benefit, then what is the point? Simply. For example, there's quite an investment in workforce training programs. I get all behind training programs, but it doesn't end there. It has to end with a job, a permanent, unsubsidized job. So with that approach or that attitude, let me just say that my attitude is that's how I view ECDev or economic development, and there's many facets to that, and but it's really job creation. And specifically, I view that as kind of a tool, an opportunity to promote your own economic security. And so while we heard a retelling of the short history, 30-year history of PDC in this community, there was a parallel action happening as well as many of these urban renewal projects or PDC projects was occurring. And I'll say, summarizing this, while that was good and a lot of celebration of the achievement and things in that placemaking, I get that. There's another side to the same time period, and that is communities of color, minorities in this community fell further behind economically in this community while many people prospered. And so what you have is, I characterize that as kind of failed public policy in whatever domain that you would like to address. Simply, folks in those categories, protected class, however you want to define them, they fell further behind the economic security opportunity. The gap widened, and so now you're presented with a situation of the haves and have-nots. And the disparity, the widening of that gap is growing, not this stuff. So with all the good planning, all the great projects, that is what happened and is happening in this community today. And so it's quite a challenge facing this community of where the vision it is for economic development and specifically the role of PDC. The words are chosen carefully of inclusion, of equity, of participation. I get all that, but the challenge will be how do you really operationalize that work or that intention? I would say a critical factor for folks that are struggling, maybe households earning less than $50,000. I don't know, pick a number, is affordability. Can you afford to stay here? Can you afford to stay here? There are permits being pulled for development of multifamily rental housing at market rate, but I would suggest that the thousands of units that are under development or planned for are not for people that live here. They are, it's intention to bring a different folk that can afford those prices, not for those that are currently here. I give you the challenge of the public policy because as a practitioner here, when I started with NEA about 11 years ago, here again, job creation, I came to an organization that had less than a dozen staff, and 11 years later, that organization now has 115 staff. Permanent jobs. It happens to be a nonprofit, but that is the impact that an organization can have if it's committed or has a vision of job creation, of economic security, paying a good wage, and making opportunity happen. The work I do with PDC in the Neighborhood Prosperity Initiative, as Lisa mentioned, is one of those areas. And there, I think the premise behind Neighborhood Partnership Initiative is one of local, neighborhood level control and self-determination. What does that community see as its vision, and how would it like to achieve that vision at a neighborhood level? It is being supported by a simplified or I guess simplified URA, so there's urban renewal monies that are available. But the idea of neighborhood control, especially neighborhood-driven decision-making, accountability is a part of the NPI. And I would say that the implementation, which is we're about almost almost 3 years in on that, is kind of a 180-degree shift from where PDC has been, where I would say that some of the stories that are being told in this community tonight, probably somewhere, is what PDC has done to my neighborhood. Mr. Russell talked about displacement. That was a direct result of what good intentions meant in this community, that lower income folks, families, households, homeowners, renters were pushed out. I'm not sure what efforts PDC implemented to mitigate that displacement. I can't tell you. I won't even pretend to try to explain the effort was gone to mitigate that displacement. I just know what resulted. And folks lost their homes and had to move away. In the work that I do is folks went eastward, right? And so that's where lesser rents, more opportunity for housing, so a drift. So I talk with electeds and program people of where's this community come from? How do we relate to, how do we can't know, we don't know, whatever, right? And so that is the impact of urban renewal in Portland, specifically in kind of the interstate corridor here. And those stories are being told again and again. And so I think the Neighborhood Prosperity Initiative is the 180-degree turn where folks have felt no control and something happened to us. At a small scale, neighborhood scale, a community presence can determine for itself its priorities and exercise that type of self-determination. The people I talk with, our participants, talk about three things to me. I mean, there's a lot of other issues, but it's jobs, housing, and education. And those are linked to our Portland's future. Some of the work that NEA does, putting my NEA hat, is we operate a private high school. And it was not our intention to get into the education, but the public education system here, Portland and others, were failing Native children and other children of color. And unfortunately, that still continues to this day, that kids of color are disproportionately not making it through the system. So an investor wants to hire, do we have a ready workforce? I say they're not prepared, there are many lost, and so there's this population out there that's still being fed with numbers, and we have to do more about that. And so NEA, in its 100 students, is trying to do something about that graduation rate and preparing young people. Housing, as Mr. Russell said, is a critical factor. It's not, some of the studies require thousands of units to be built, and pick a number how much you want to pay for a single unit, but we're talking millions, if not $1 billion of housing development to meet a need. I'll merely say that what is required is a healthy continuum of housing options that include subsidy, special programs and I think from a neighborhood point of view, there must be home ownership, a very active home ownership portion of that, and a continuum of housing are options that that we are working to put in place. But I think the critical factor to how much affordable housing do you have and the challenge of affordability is that our community must be serious about how do we improve the earning ability or income to help people stay. And that's a very complex, complicated matter to address, but that is the challenge that we have before us. The price of staying in Portland or the cost of needing to move and disrupt. I happen to believe that stable neighborhoods with strong, nurturing families that have permanency and stability, I think has a reduction in social service needs and desires. I think you have better performing children in classes. For every move a child makes, whether they're in foster care or a family is disrupted and moving, they suffer immeasurably loss in their learning that current school year. So any disruption puts that child further behind. So you're going to hear about policy that supports having early learning, and we're into early learning, but the readiness by third grade is a key indicator. After that, if they're not at par, they begin to come further behind and become part of the statistic that I introduced here. And that is the challenge of not being prepared to take care of yourself, to live in an unstable housing situation, or you're not sure where your next job will be, if you have a job, or do you find a training program? And I got the 30-second message. Let me just give you an example of what I meant by neighborhood control. And some of you who know Cully, we happen to have a building there called the Sugar Shack. And it's been an eyesore. It's been I think you call blight, you show Sugar Shack. And it has a history onto itself, but the NPI, the Cully Boulevard Alliance, made a commitment to a group, which I'm a part of, to begin site acquisition of the Cully parcel for redevelopment purposes. We approached banks, lenders, the City of Portland, PDC had all been involved, and they really struggled to try to make it work when there was consensus that we got to knock it down. We got to get rid of it, and we just haven't figured out how to do it yet. The point of me making this point is that community group went into the kind of crowdsourcing funding and made it available and raised $60,000 toward acquisition of that part. They had no connection to anybody but wanted to do right or do something better. So that is the potential at a neighborhood level of momentum and commitment to a project. That clarity of purpose and the clarity of the project, I think, can build consensus and secure investment, and a successful project will come from future investors. So I show that as just an example of possibility. There's many lessons learned. I don't think we got it quite right yet, but it's potential. I think as a practitioner, I still deal with too many silos. The city silo and the bureaus and the different departments, the county or the state. If I'm going to do another public housing project, it's going to take me about 5 years to put all the layering of public housing monies together. And that's the speed at which we work. I know that I'm going past line, so I just wanted to thank everybody for my time given to me to present.
You'll have more, don't worry.
Okay.
We have time to go here.
Thank you.
And in fact, I'm trying to sort of consolidate the types of questions that you all are submitting here. And I want to start with a contrast, actually, between what you, Ray, were just talking about and where we started with you, Chris, and to see whether, in fact, there is as big a gulf between the objective of economic development being growing the traded sector, and the objective of economic development being neighborhood involvement and stability of families, communities, neighborhoods, and people. Perhaps the thing that ties those two things together are jobs. That's one possibility. I don't know if that is where you would go with that question. But to me, we ended up with a rather big gulf from here to there, and I would like to hear how you respond to each other's notions.
Yeah, no, I think I tried to reference the gulf. We have two economies, and this isn't a Portland phenomenon. It's not necessarily a U.S. phenomenon. It's a bit of a global phenomenon. We have aspects of our community growing very fast and attaining lots of wealth, and many getting left behind. So right out front, I think there certainly there's a gap that we all see and know, and data points to it, and I don't think there needs to be much convincing. It's a good lead into how PDC is kind of focusing under its new strategic plan that Lisa showed, and its focus on widely shared prosperity. And I think that comes in many forms. It actually comes in all three of our forms. It's not an issue that you just solve with one. You don't recruit a company in and suddenly You know, we have a balanced economy and balanced opportunity. You don't work in one neighborhood and suddenly you do it, and you don't develop in a certain way. So I think you're seeing complex issues need many solutions to it. To just answer kind of you know, the work I do around traded sector and what Ray's referring to, which would correlate to a lot of our community development work within PDC, of which Ray helps us lead through his leadership in the community, is certainly it's jobs and it's quality jobs. So we have to pay particular attention to livable wages, but also ones that are accessible, and that can mean educational attainment. Not everyone's going to have a bachelor's or a master's degree, and so what does that middle wage, middle class job look like, and how do you access it? It's accessible in terms of things like transportation as well. If you look at our city where some of our lower income neighborhoods are and where they go to work, that access, I have much easier time living in Northeast Portland, getting downtown in a well-paying job than many do who live in low-income neighborhoods and go work somewhere else. That accessibility can be strung out in a whole different ways. I do think the other aspect of it, and it leads into, and so on the job front, traded sector, I need to help industry create more of these middle jobs in our community. I think there's an element of wealth creation that we've talked about. There's home ownership. Wealth creation also can come through business ownership as well, hence some of the strong focus we have around our entrepreneurship programs, particularly focusing on communities of color. I think it's a major factor when you look at family wealth. Job is one factor, so is other forms of wealth creation in terms of ownership. That's longer term. So that would be one example. And I'll just end with we do a lot of focus around traded sector, and that kind of what drives those macroeconomic metrics that we all look at. But I think we have to look at other forms of employment or opportunity, whether those could be anchor institutions, hospitals, certain types of employers in neighborhoods, and those can be non-traded sector. So how we better connect our residents to those opportunities matters as well. So that would be a quick answer. That's a long way of saying I think we agree that there's the gap. I think Ray had actually the perfect how to operationalize inclusion and equity. I think it's probably fair to invite PDC back 5 years from now after our new strategic plan gets rolled out and kind of see how we did that.
Ray, yes.
I'd like to offer a couple comments, and I think the key word is I talked with John briefly before we started about intentionality is a really key concept here. Being very intentional of what outcomes or goals you want to attain, as opposed to what I think has been a part of the record with many of the agreements that PDC has negotiated with developers, and that is kind of the notion of goals are goals, but these are more aspirational goals, and there really is no, hammer to it, there's no so what if you didn't do that. So I think being very clear and intentional, if it's about equity or contracting requirements, be very intentional about that particular goal. There are plenty of very intelligent people at PDC to figure this thing out, right? So intentionality, whether it's on job creation, Chris presented to a working group on a goal of about an $18 an hour, $40,000 a year job, and I think that's a very solid, tangible, but the community that I work with, I got to figure out the scale. How do I get my community, which has its issues, prepared for that opportunity? So he has to work on that job security, that destination. However, there has to be an intentional relationship from Chris to me to benefit the community that's now locked in a cycle of generational poverty, and how do they have not made it through school, but they have now grown up a little bit and are motivated. What type of technical skills that doesn't require a certificate? How can we prepare that young person to get that job, and that may take some time. And I think with a willing employer, their patience will pay off for this community. So here again, the benefit that I have, the community benefit that oftentimes we talk about, needs to be intentional, and I think it needs to be directly tied and be commensurate with the level of public subsidy, right? So the more a developer wants or desires in terms of a public subsidy in any fashion, then they should commit to certain practices or deliverables. And I think that clarity of community benefit, everybody, it forms a transparency. Whether it's you're building something, the construction trades, we have prepared a community benefits agreement that talks about subcontracting, workforce participation. We can get there together, and it does not cost the contractor any more money to do good business in this community. So intentionality and being clear about the community benefit would take us a long way there.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, Barbara, let me give you an example of intentionality. I mentioned that we determined when I was on PDC that gentrification wasn't the issue, it was displacement. And so if renters are converted to owners, then gentrification is a good thing for them. They're not displaced. And so just in talking to the staff said, well, you can't believe the number of programs we have to convert renters to owners. I mean, just look on the web. Well, the people who needed that kind of help weren't looking on the web, needless to say. And so what we said, staff needs to start knocking on doors at dinner time, because you have to, the stuff that Chris is talking about doesn't trickle down automatically. It's got to be, if your intentions are to carry this down to ground, then your actions have to carry it down to ground.
Go ahead, Lisa.
So I want to add two things.
Pull the microphone toward you. So.
Sure. One is, because we didn't touch on it very much, but I actually think another role of kind of where intentionality has really changed. So I've been at PDC for 12 years, has really changed is how we contract. So it goes back to actually Ray. So what Ray touched upon, and it makes a huge difference in terms of money that's going out in the community, is it's not only kind of what do we leverage out of our private partners, but what does PDC spend on its own projects, which is a pretty sizable amount of dollars. And we've made, I would say, a very intentional effort at shifting how we invest over the past 5 years or so. The other, and I don't know how to kind of phrase it more eloquently, but it's also about community. Like, I think the whole idea of crowdsourcing and how do we get communities talking with each other, because ultimately these are huge complex challenges. So when you kind of look at our strategic plan, you'll see there's a whole kind of goal that's very intentional around 4 areas that PDC ultimately plays a certain amount of role in, but we don't lead them and we can facilitate them. Things like affordable housing, things like workforce development. There's a large number of parties who are kind of dedicated to the effort, and it's not necessarily a fragmented conversation, but it's certainly a conversation that's happening in multiple communities around Portland. And how do you bring that conversation together? And what's the role that PDC can play versus others? And I think that's kind of also a very important, we have to be cognizant of it, because we're certainly, a lot of us are type A personalities, and we have to be cognizant of what we can do, what we can facilitate, and then really what takes partners to make it happen.
Well, that actually is one of the questions about which I have many little index cards here. Let's stick for a moment with the affordable housing part of it, because there is no way, if we continue the way we've been going, pushing everybody who can't afford to stay put in Portland out to Gresham and further, then we have failed, it seems to me. And that I think there would be agreement here. And yet, within the urban renewal districts, the commitment to affordable housing has not been, let's say, a resounding success. And so I would really like to hear how we tackle that. John raised one specific, which is to get rid of the ban on inclusionary zoning, which you might want to elaborate on for people who don't know what it is. But I would like to hear from the rest of you, what do we do in the immediate to prevent the pushing the people who can't afford to live in Portland right now out of Portland? What do we do about that? Because that they're not going to be able to take advantage of the jobs we might be creating 10 years from now if they're not living here. So would you like to start with the inclusionary zoning, just two sentences to explain what you're talking about?
Sure. That's not one sentence, is it?
No, doesn't count.
If a development goes up greater than X units, Y percentage need to be for affordable folks? The devil's in the details, obviously, but it means that every time a project greater than, say, 50 units happens, affordable housing goes with it. Well, the benefit, if I may,
yes,
for my third and fourth, is, well, our older daughter spent time in New Orleans in the projects, and after World War II, the federal government, in its wisdom, said, oh my God, we've got this affordable housing problem. We're going to build massive projects in the major American cities, which turned out to be absolutely the wrong thing to do, because people, Shannon said, kids in New Orleans, the only way that they got out of the projects was to go to jail, because it was just this cesspool. Inclusionary zoning is a fabulous thing for the people who are in those units, because the developer is incentivized to make those blend in.
When you say the devil's in the details, I met one of those devils in the details just the other night, and it was a young social work student, but from an affluent family, very white, living in affordable housing in the Pearl, a studio that cost $1,000 a month. And that would be affordable if it were a 3-bedroom apartment. But it's not, it's a studio. And that passes for affordable under some rubric within the urban renewal. So that, to me, I mean, very much the devil is in the details. And I would really like to hear what the plans are. Lisa, this is your turf, I think, probably. So solve this problem for us, would you please?
Well, so first, I guess I'll kind of put some technical pieces on the table. So the way that the rent level is calculated is based on average median family income. And it's based on kind of the size of unit, and it's based on kind of your income and how many people are living. So it's not set by urban renewal by any means. It's actually set by the Fed. Their HUD has standards. So that's where it's set. It's not set locally. And I would say, I think our board has had extensive conversations and would agree that it's a really tough challenge. And the challenge has been the revenue stream to support the goals. And so urban renewal, again, at the end of the day, urban renewal is a financing mechanism. And affordable housing is a policy, and that financing mechanism can be directed at that policy. I think what we've seen is that financing mechanism alone has kind of been, to a certain extent, it has fulfilled some of those goals, but it hasn't fulfilled the goals to the level that the community desires it. And I think it's the question of whether it's inclusionary zoning or other tools that, as a city, and you'll see this in the strategic plan, as a city we need to come together, and I think we have long conversations with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability around this, to put our heads together and say, what are the other tools? Because kind of urban renewal on its own, again, it's a financing mechanism. It will create a certain amount of resources off of redevelopment, but it doesn't necessarily accomplish a policy.
And do you see the objectives of urban renewal changing now in the city of Portland, and if so, how?
Yeah, I mean, I think our policy, our investments change on an annual basis, right? So I would say 5 years ago, when there was an economic downturn, all of the work that we did in the central city was targeted at growing jobs because we didn't have job growth. Today, we have a very clear kind of where the market gap is. And so PDC very often steps into the market gap. Where the market gap is affordability. And I think it's a huge market gap.
Housing affordability.
Housing affordability. I think folks would also say kind of lease affordability for small businesses who want to have a presence in the downtown or in another location for them to be able to grow. I think it's a real estate affordability challenge, because our real estate market, kind of relative to what it costs to build, to what kind of folks' income is just, you don't have it, it's not it hasn't grown proportionately. So our real estate market has grown disproportionately. And as Chris referenced, Portland is kind of not on its own in this challenge. This is a challenge that you see, if anything. I think Next City just published a huge article around affordable housing, and the challenge that it is in 11 cities across the US is huge.
And do you think that PDC, and this is to all of you, is the appropriate agency to be tackling that problem? I mean, we also have a housing bureau. How do you work together, and how do you work with the mayor's office, and how does that get coordinated?
So I would say we are increasingly, especially over the past 6 months to a year, we are increasingly working together. I think for kind of the past 4 or 5 years, the Housing Bureau has taken an approach of what they called kind of a NOFA approach, which is much more of a market-driven approach. I think based on more current conversations, they've kind of they're starting to look at much more kind of site-driven, site control approach because we have specific geographies that we want units to be focused in. I think one of the things, because often it's an interesting conversation in terms of kind of the neighborhoods in the central city, I always find it's a fascinating statistic. There's a pretty large preponderance actually of subsidized housing in the central city. I mean, and there's a reason behind it. And so you'll see the Planning and Sustainability Commission is really pushing that in as much as this is a regional issue, it's also about thinking about where do you put housing, not only in terms of mixed income, but also near transit so you can get to work, right? So it's not just kind of putting work near the housing, but putting housing near the transit so that you can access your work in different forms, not have to own a car.
Does anybody else want to add to that? Yes.
Yeah, I would just say that I would hope that there are better days ahead for PDC and the Housing Bureau to work more intimately together, because we tried to divide it. I mean, the same people that want to have brought back together are the same people that said, no, we have to divide this thing. From a community point of view, it's all connected, right? So coordination of resources, the tools that each have needs to be applied, I say, at a neighborhood scale. And I don't care who pays for it. I just want to see it done, right? And so I'm currently working on displacement project. We refer to it as Cully 2. It's an attempt to identify 100 homes and do some critical home repairs and some energy improvements for purposes of anti-displacement. We think that by addressing critical repairs, which is resulted from deferred maintenance, or they couldn't afford the roof or the windows, or it's energy inefficient, if in fact you can make that intervention early on, I think you can help that homeowner stay in place, take the pressure off them, with a lot of people in the neighborhood now offering cash for their home, cash buys. And so we have to do, so we're studying that. What we found in just the initial, we just started the project in November, of the first 7 homes, all 5 required roofs, a roof. There was active mold in 4 of those 5 homes. Excessive moisture. The homeowner was taping up certain rooms to direct the heat. He was jerry-rigging, sheeting plastic, and these are elders, communities of color. So that's what's out there. People struggling in a home they own with deferred maintenance and critical repairs, and if we don't do something about that, they'll be the first to offer their house for demolition, which I oppose, right? But so acquisition rehab is always cheaper than new development. And so my point being is, I think the coordination between, in this case, PDC and the housing is critical. The better coordination, the right contracting or commitment of resources needs to be figured out. But I think that it requires a comprehensive approach with many kind of factors of retaining folks in their home, maybe an intervention to replace that roof or to aggregate that and get a good deal on that. And so it requires a little time to kind of figure these things out. We're also doing radon testing and air quality testing. So as an implementer, I hope to share some information on what I found, right? That to me is a public health issue, which belongs in this building here. Right? Active mold is a county response, that
Yeah.
air quality, you get it? So it's a public health issue, right? The quality of the condition, the contractor, it could be an economic development contract. Really, it requires this kind of alignment of policy and effort.
That gets to the heart of, again, another set of questions that I would really like to hear also from Chris and John about, as well as the two of you, about coordination. Whether it is on allowing people or helping people to be able to stay in their homes or in our city, but also, what is the role of PDC in economic development today, when we've gone beyond urban renewal, not to the exclusion of urban renewal, but obviously including many other things? How does it coordinate with not just the Housing Bureau, but planning and sustainability and Office of Equity? And I mean, you could name any number of bureaus. Who's in charge, and how do you coordinate, and how do you coordinate with the mayor's office and so on? I would really like to hear both aspirational and factual how it is today from you, if you could.
So I'll take a first stab and you feel. So from a question of how do we coordinate with the mayor's office, so our executive director actually meets on a monthly basis with all of the city commissioners. So we have a really close working relationship with all of the city commissioners. And then we meet more regularly with the mayor's office. We have the planning and development director, all of the planning and development groups or bureaus of the city actually meet on a regular basis with each other and talk about key issues at a leadership level. And then Patrick also meets on a regular basis with the heads of key bureaus where we work really closely in partnership. I think, and on a day-to-day, and then down at a staff level, I think similarly in particular geographies, you have really close staff relationships between PDC, the Bureau of Transportation, the Office of Equity. I mean, we just have kind of staff teams that kind of grow up over time around communities. I think kind of it's an interesting question if I had to, and this is me answering it personally. I think one of the challenges is when we kind of come back into the office, we will often see ourselves as kind of working for the Bureau. And I would agree, I've always argued, I think when you go out into the community, they see you as working for the city. And we need to learn to bridge that divide, right? Like when we go out into the community, nobody knows the difference between a staff person who works for the Transportation Bureau or the Parks Bureau, which is actually one of the reasons very often when we go out into the community, PDC has played that facilitator role of communicating on behalf of the bureaus, like everything that's happening within your community. And I think that's someplace, especially through things like the action plan, we've attempted to go back to, which is it's about your community. What does your community want to accomplish? And then it's our job to a certain extent to come back in-house and facilitate those conversations with all of the bureaus.
Well, I disagree with that to some degree. I think that's the proper role of the Planning Bureau. And what's happened is very significant, but it's happened so slowly that you don't realize that. To me, I realize, Barbara, that there's the issue about coordination and so on, but I do think in this case versus planning and transportation and PDC, the real problem is the lack of role differentiation. So take Lentz or Gateway. It should have been the responsibility of planning to vet what those communities wanted. PDC didn't need to be a part of that whole process until and unless that was done.
To answer that kind of more from the economic development side, or at least the traded sector, I would say where we do it well, and we've spent a lot of time the last, I would say, 3 to 5 years, is kind of the coordination between different economic development actors, whether that's, I showed a couple on the slide at the state, regional, local level, and how we partner and the roles and responsibilities we have and the different resources that we have to bring a project together or implement a program or assist a business. So to me, I don't think it's as strong as it has ever been. I think when we went through the strategic planning process, we had an outside consulting firm come in and kind of look at PDC's work. And one of the areas it found where it needs to better collaborate is between the economic development and community development work. So I think that's why you're hearing Ray and myself talk about how do we it's the concepts of widely shared prosperity. How do we utilize economic development tools on the traded sector side? How do we match some of that to benefit our folks in our neighborhoods? And I think you're going to see a lot more collaboration and coordination on that level between perhaps within the city, but external to the city. So that would be an area for improvement on the strict economic development side. I think it's been a positive the last 5 years.
We are very close to having to close, and I would say if there is any of the four of you or all four of you who have truly 15 seconds or 30 seconds of closing comments, you are welcome to make them, and then I'll try and do some kind of summary of all of this in 12 seconds.
Well, I think one of the things that didn't get the coverage tonight that should have, is the whole idea of placemaking as an economic development tool. People come here. Mary's nephew came here for the food, even though he's a general manager of a Michelin one-star in Brooklyn. And so parks are created, streetcars, light rail, that placemaking function, I think, is a very important part of economic development.
I would just add, I think we've talked a lot about a lot of very complex issues, and I think one of the benefits of PDC is you're seeing folks that focus on traded sector, on placemaking, on community development, really start, and I think we started this 5 years ago, and I think we're honing it now, of kind of shared goals and kind of seeing the agency bring these disparate resources together, different tools. We all have different tools with a shared goal, and I think that's one of the biggest positives I see in the future for us is how does PDC play that role to tackle some pretty challenging problems.
He's a more eloquent speaker. I think I would echo Chris's. I think one of the things that PDC plays as a unique role, kind of thinking about what do we do differently than other bureaus, is we bring the private sector to the table. And I think thinking really intentionally about a city, about kind of how the city needs the private sector at the table and where we need the private sector at the table should guide PDC's work. Because I think we're the single bureau who does that the most successfully out of the city. And so that should be our charge, is to kind of bring them to these complex urban challenges.
Ray, you have the final word.
Well, thank you. Well, let me begin by saying, while I attempted to be constructively critical of PDC, I also want to be a person that acknowledges their good work in moving this equity agenda. They're one of the few bureaus that I've worked with directly that are really trying to operationalize that. There are other bureaus that talk about it. But I have to say that PDC is doing something about that. So I just want to acknowledge that good work. The issue before us, I think, is one of courageous leadership in this community, whether the mayor or Deborah, the county chair, or the chair of the board of PDC. Courageous leadership is going to require a clear vision and momentum and drive and a sense of urgency to move us to work better together, a sense of urgency to get us out of the silos. The difficulty I've experienced is not so much with good staff, competent staff. I've had a hell of a time working with legal counsels of these different places who are risk averse, and they're advising their electeds. You can't do that because you're going to get sued or something. I don't know. So we need to kind of work that through and be very creative about moving a reform agenda. And I'll just say that some of what we're fighting is years of inertia, lack of change or critical thinking. that doesn't pass the sniff tests or the common sense tests now, whether it's procurement practices or end goals or being very clear, we can get there together. I believe that. And I think that the opportunity is, can we manage limited resources, generate more resources, do some placement? I agree with this. It's the real deal at a neighborhood scale. And I say the answer is yes. So better days are ahead.
There you go. I think we chose absolutely the right panel. I'm very pleased with how far you've moved this discussion along, and there's a lot on our plate as the League of Women Voters to get through our own process of coming up with new positions after 30 years on economic development and urban renewal. But you have been invaluable, and we'll just close with that. Thank you very much.